For the first 300 years of Christianity, no follower of Jesus would take up arms against someone else. I think that's quite remarkable, and it's a tradition that we lost somewhere along the way, not lost totally. As time went on, we began to accommodate war as kind of the lesser of two evils. It was to mitigate the suffering caused by war. And then, as we also know from our long centuries of existence, we joined in becoming the aggressors in war as well. And so we have a lot in our history to repent of, to ask forgiveness of, and throughout that same history, there was always a tradition of trying to resolve conflict through nonviolent means and through peacemaking. And so we are proud to be part of that tradition, and we are, especially in this last century, the 20th century, increasingly the official teaching of the church was that we must work for peace and not war. And some of us older folks in this room will remember when Pope Paul VI spoke at the United Nations in New York. Saturday, it will be exactly 49 years ago that he made his speech. And one of the brief comments from his speech that reverberated around the world and touched the hearts of so many of us was "No more war, never again war."
You can add your opinion about our military mission on nowpolin.ca. Select Canadian Federation and go to Security and Police, and there you find affiliation with NATO as well as military mission. Here's the poll. You can participate.
Every culture, every family, every faith community has its stories, and stories constitute the social glue that tends to bind groups, families, faith traditions, and indeed countries, nations together. So the story I want to talk about first off is related to my hat that I bought from the Canadian Legion, or as it's called, the Royal Canadian Legion. I'll pass it around. It says, you can see, Vimy 1917, obviously a high point, and on the side it says, Birth of a Nation. So here we have the Governor General of Canada in Kandahar, 2010, with Walt Nitinchuk, who was the Chief of Defense Staff. It's a very Canadian shot. They're drinking Tim Hortons coffee, and they have poppies on, and I guess Tim Hortons coffee and the McDonald's and Burger Kings that existed at Kandahar airfield during the Afghan War, or Canada's Afghan War, somehow symbolized the way of life being defended there. So, Governor General Johnson was, at the time in 2012, when our book Warrior Nation came out, was at the same time that we had the start of the commemorations of the War of 1812. People will probably remember that. And here is what our current Governor General said. When we study our history and the wars in which we have fought, the wars overseas, it has been to purchase our freedom and our liberties. So this is what I would refer to as the official story, and the story that's being told of Canada and World War I, that World War I was all about a fight to defend freedom and the plucky little Belgians, or the plucky Belgians, plucky little Belgium. The Belgians aren't necessarily as short as I am. So this is a very common trope, a very common story of Canada and war. So he doesn't necessarily say World War I, he says all the wars in which Canada participated. So we can only assume that this includes the Boer War, the suppression of the Métis Rebellion in the 19th century, the Korean War, the war in Kandahar, they all sort of come together as one great struggle for freedom. And what we want to try to do is provide a counter-narrative to that particular official story of Canada. So the current government has announced it's going to spend $83 million in commemorating the various centenaries of World War I and the 75th anniversary of the start of World War II. And just last August, a few months ago, our Prime Minister, at the occasion of the centenary of the beginning of World War I, was quoted as saying that by any measure, Canada as a truly independent country was forged in the fires of the Western Front. So again, the birth of the nation's story, the story that is encapsulated in the little baseball cap that I passed around. Now this prompted one Newfoundland editorialist to scratch his head and wonder about the Battle of Beaumont-Hamel at the Somme in 1916, when the entire Newfoundland regiment was essentially wiped out. Hundreds of men went over the top. A very tiny percentage returned. So the question that we ask is, can you really make a nation by putting an entire generation of young men to death? Keeping in mind that 66,000 Canadians died in World War I. So there's got to be another way of telling the story of World War I and Canada. So here we have a painting. Here's two stories of World War I as exemplified by art. Both of these paintings are to be found in the collection of the National War Museum in Ottawa. This one is, it's called The Second Battle of Ypres. Richard Jack. And so what we have here is an image of a World War I battle, obviously, at Ypres in Belgium. And we have a heroic figure standing above the trench line, pointing forward to attack the enemy who are situated in the background. And so one of the things that this image gets at is this traditional romantic, heroic notion of war. The problem with the image is that Richard Jack had never been and never did, as far as I know, go to the front, the Western Front in World War I. He painted this painting, I guess, from what he heard. And the story that was being told in England at the time was one of a glorious endeavor. So here's this officer standing above the trench line. Not terribly accurate, because anybody who's read anything about World War I, or any other war for that matter, knows that it's not terribly wise to stand up and expose yourself above the trench line when the enemy is there with machine guns and snipers. So that's story number one, represented by Canadian or art that is held by the War Museum. Story number two is a painting by Frederick Varley. And Varley did go to the battlefields of World War I, to the Somme and to Flanders. And this is a very different image of the war. You have a cartload of bodies, some blood, a lot of mud being a principal metaphor for World War I, of course. Some grave diggers with some temporary looking grave markers, crosses, sort of a dark, gloomy image. And you can't see it on the screen, but the title that Varley gave his painting was For What? So those are two dramatically different stories, different images of World War I that we get being held by the War Museum. Ypres is a town that now calls itself a city of peace. So I went to Ypres and to Vimy earlier this year in April, and this is a quote from the mayor of Ypres about war and about remembrance and commemoration and how wars are remembered by some and remembered by others. So haven't we been using the language of heroism? Think of the Jack painting. And sacrifice. Think of the traditional Christian notions of sacrifice. So the notion of sacrifice, very, very important in our culture. For too long, while actually this is all about mass slaughter, spread over 4 years in the name of the ideology of power. So a very different conception by a serving politician in Flanders, in Ypres, about how we might remember war. This is a slide of In Flanders Fields Museum. The building is a completely accurate reconstruction of that medieval cloth hall that stands right in the center of Ypres and contains one of the best museums that I've ever seen. It's a traditional war museum on one level with lots of artifacts of machine guns and rifles, but also many, many other stories of people, civilians, the Christmas truce, whole bunches of other tales, and it amounts to really a peace museum. And it's a very, very significant piece of remembrance culture and commemoration. Here's Canada's former $10 bill. I say former because I've got a slide of the current one. So people can see Macrae's poem In Flanders Fields on the lower left. A UN peacekeeper, a woman, significantly with the UN blue beret, unarmed, holding a pair of binoculars. Doves of peace, the words in the service of peace in both languages behind her, and a family commemorating, remembering war. So that was, up until a couple of years ago, Canada's $10 bill. Today's $10 bill has a picture of the Conservative Prime Minister of 1867, Sir John A. Macdonald, and a railway train. So this is a different way of commenting, or in fact not commenting, on war. We'll just erase those peace images. This is Canada's biggest and most important war memorial at Vimy Ridge that I also visited in April. And one of the things I realized while wandering around the memorial by Walter Allward that was inaugurated in the 1930s, that this is not so much a war memorial as a memorial to peace. So the principal statuary, the principal works of art at the Vimy Memorial, most Canadians know the image of the Vimy Memorial more so than the War Memorial in Ottawa that the current government has promised to rededicate during this commemoration. Our Peace Quest effort has a project. We'd like to rededicate the Peace Tower to peace to mark Canada's 150th birthday. But that aside, Mother Canada, formerly known as Canada Bereft, the biggest, most prominent bit of statuary at the Vimy Memorial, shows a woman in mourning, her head bowed, shrouded. And one of the other statues, the breaking of the sword. Now here I stand in a Christian chapel. The reference is, of course, biblical. I showed this slide this morning to high school students. Can anybody tell me which part of the Bible it comes from? Thou shalt break your swords into plowshares? Isaiah. Okay, so there it is. Old Testament reference, but significant to see that biblical reference in stone, in limestone, on Canada's biggest, most important war memorial. So again, Allward was originally suggested to Allward that these figures in this statue show somebody stamping on a German helmet. And he rejected that out of hand because he said, my monument, our monument, should be about peace, and that smacks too much of militarism. So we're going to have the breaking of the sword. So our principal war memorial is, in fact, a peace monument. The Assir Tower, also in Flanders, Sister Marie mentioned the 3 words that Pope Paul spoke at the UN not too long ago. Those three words are, this is another war museum or peace museum in Flanders. On four sides, those words in four different languages. So this is a culture of commemoration that is not about an enemy. It's not about us and them. It's about no more war. There's a traditional Canadian war memorial in Kingston, Ontario. Very much the official story again. Soldier looking up, valiant, weapon displayed prominently. This is another example of what the Flemish peace activists and researchers I met call the imperial tradition of commemoration. This is the Menin Gate in Ypres, has the names of all the imperial soldiers who were killed, whose bodies were never found, and through this gate, Menin is a place many, many thousands of soldiers marched to their death at the spot where the Menin Gate is. And according to the imperial way of memorializing and commemorating, every night tourists gather, somebody plays the last post, and there's a moment of silence. So it's quite poignant, but at the same time, it's very imperial. We can't see the words at the top of the slides, but the words are pro rege, pro patria, for king and country. So the message, not too quite explicit, is these men died for the king and country, for the empire. So again, part of that imperial war commemoration that we, as part of our Peace Quest, we're trying to promote a parallel, a different kind of commemoration, more in the tradition of the Europeans and particularly the Flemish annalists that I spoke of. North of Ypres, the Battle of Langemarck, 1914, Germans, thousands went to their deaths, mass slaughter, and it was commemorated by National Socialists in the 20s and 30s. The rumor, the myth, is that these young men, poorly trained apparently, went to their deaths singing the German national anthem, Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. Who knows if it's true? It's part of myth that was seized by the National Socialists in the 1930s. This is how they chose to remember Langemarck. So here we have the German chancellor in the 1930s visiting Langemarck. There's another way of German remembrance of those battles, however. This is a cemetery not too far from Langemarck. The title of the statues is Grieving Parents. The sculptor is Kathe Kollwitz, a German pacifist, socialist artist whose work began in the late 19th century. And her son, Peter, I believe his name was killed in the first weeks of World War I. She said goodbye to him, and 10 days later he was dead. It took Kathe Kollwitz something like 15 or 16 years to bring herself to sculpt these images of herself and her husband at this German war cemetery in Belgium, grieving parents. So back to the image of Mother Canada, Canada bereft. How do you remember war? Grief. Is there a big role for the military in this remembrance? No. So, the Battle of Langemarck, memorialized, remembered in two very distinct and indeed opposing ways. The official story, the National Socialist story, and Kathe Kollwitz's story of how we remember. And Armstrong argues in a very good little book called A Short History of Myth that we need myths that will help us to identify with all our fellow human beings, not simply those who belong to our ethnic, national, or ideological tribe, which brings back the Battle of Langemarck, right? We need myths that help us to realize the importance of compassion. We need myths that help us venerate the earth as sacred once again, instead of merely using it as a resource. So, another way that contending notions of myth are at play in our culture. I visited the Island of Ireland Memorial Park south of Ypres, and this is all, and a lot of what I'm saying here is all about how official commemoration is, and what curators and museum folks, what images they choose, what words they choose. Do they choose Lest We Forget? Do they choose John McCrae in Flanders Fields? Do they choose Martial Glory? Or, in this case, do they choose words? And these are the words that I found 9 plaques on the ground, stones carved, and in those stones carved the words of Irish soldiers who served in Belgium in 1914 to 1918. And the words are from David Starrett of the 9th Royal Irish Rifles. So the curtain fell over that tortured country of unmarked graves and unburied fragments of men. Murder and massacre, the innocent slaughtered for the guilty, the poor man for the sake of the greed of the already rich, the man of no authority made victim of the man who had gathered importance and wished to keep it. So a different story from, say, the official story, that of Mr. Harper, Canada's forged in the fires of World War I, and the war was, in spite of all the death, really a positive thing, or that's at least the implication. R.H. Thompson, people will know the Canadian actor. R.H. Thompson has this magnificent project called The World Remembers, in which he wants to project every fall at the anniversaries of World War I the names of every soldier killed in that war. He probably won't be able to get them all, but he's got 9 countries cooperating, and he's made a lot of progress towards just showing the names not only of in Canada, not only of the Canadian dead, but of the Turkish dead, the German dead, the Austrian dead, the Russian dead, the Italian dead, the Flemish dead, the French dead, the African dead, the Indian dead. You know, we have to remember that this was a colonial imperial war, and that tens of thousands of colonial troops were slaughtered.
You can add your opinion about our military mission on nowpolin.ca. Select Canadian Federation and go to Security and Police, and there you find affiliation with NATO as well as military mission. Here's the poll. You can participate.
What is the rationale then for a Department of Peace in Canada? Well, let me just say, peace is the highest and greatest aspiration of all peoples in all times, and yet I can only think of 2 governments in the world that have a Minister of Peace and a Department of Peace. Every country in the world has a War Department. Now, after World War II, they called them the Departments of Defense. Now, a Defense Department is a wonderful thing. You have the ability to defend your own nation and your own sovereign territory, but not the ability to attack another nation. But here we have a situation where the Departments of Defense really were and are still the Department of War, as they always were and will continue to be. And in 2003, the very year we're talking about, when Canada considered its mission to Afghanistan, the only ministry, the only department that actually had an idea about what to do was the Department of Defense and the chief of the defense staff that said, we can do a combat mission. And by the way, on the side, we could also do a peacekeeping mission. That was false. All of our commitment went to that combat. And look at the result of that in Afghanistan today. A complete mess with millions dead, with the infrastructure destroyed. And the Taliban, who we set out to destroy, have emerged and are the likely government in the future of that country when the NATO forces, and you can also ask, what is NATO doing, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, what is it doing in Asia? What is it doing in the Middle East? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization? It's a question that we need to ponder. So when we look at the mandate now for what we're proposing for the Minister of Peace, and the core mandate, conflict transformation by peaceful means at home and abroad, conflict transformation by peaceful means. We will always have conflict. Conflict is endemic in our species. And when the rules of the game are followed, which are nonviolence, which are hearing all sides, which are embracing all sides to a conflict, then we can get a creative and positive outcome. So we're not saying a world of peace and harmony. We're not saying that, because the creative spark for positive change, when the rules of the game are followed, are positive and move the country and all the world's people forward. These are some of the ideas that we have. As I said, there's nobody in cabinet that really represents peace, certainly not foreign affairs. Foreign affairs is addicted to compatibility with American foreign policy. This is abundantly clear all the time. And we do not have an independent foreign policy in Canada. And develop the long-range thinking that looks at the root causes of violence, not simply putting out a fire. That will not work. We can see that abundantly clear in many parts of the world today. As an incubator for the creative responses to violence. And as the UN consistently reminds us that the most critical thing that we need is early detection and early intervention into situations which have the potential to emerge into violence. And so that would be one of the functions, to act as a censor and to act as an incubator for ideas, creative ideas for resolving conflict. And finally, the UN system has a whole number of treaties and other kinds of documents which are really models for world peace. And as you know, the whole charter of the UN, the whole idea of the UN is about ending the scourge of war, which is the first line of the Constitution of the UN. But we need a link between the UN, our UN ambassador, and the Canadian government for the implementation of these treaties and other documents. They're, first of all, unarmed civilians, professionally trained and accredited, and recognized, accepted, an effective element in conflict transformation, peacekeeping, and peace building. And what I mean here is, what I'm seeing here is a parallel structure, really, you could see it this way, to the military structure that we have in this country, which is very well endowed. And it begins with peace cadets. No, not peace cadets. They're called the military cadets. And it builds up then through officer training and eventually commissioned officers and so forth. We need a parallel structure for peace builders, for young people who are in their teens, who are not interested in preparing for combat, but are interested in peace building, that we have peace cadets, and that we have alternative training at a professional level of peace builders, because there's a science to peace building, a science and art to peace building that has been very, very well developed by many organizations in the world, but most all of them are non-governmental.
Hi, do you have an opinion? If you want to register it, go to nowpolling.ca right now, and you can register whatever kind of opinion you would like. And if you don't see it, you can scroll to the bottom of the page and you can put your own question down and poll yourself. Yay! What a good idea.